You're listening to Many Lumens, where we talk about and find meaning in the intersections of art, social change, and popular culture. I'm your host, Maori Karmael Holmes. In this episode, I speak with filmmaker Janicza. We chat about everything from accountability and friendship to her hands-on creative process and the importance of choosing your battles. We also talk about her latest feature, Zola, and our shared childhood obsession with Barbies. Welcome, Janicza. Thank you so much for showing up to do this second episode of our new show, Many Lumens. I really had a good time talking to you at Sundance, and as you know, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I was really thinking about how Sundance feels like a decade ago.
Are you sure that wasn't 5-6 years ago? Because I'm pretty sure in the last 200 plus days, I have aged. I've thought about our conversation a lot this year. It's probably one of the best conversations I've had, I would say, in my life around work. And you asked me questions that I hadn't ever thought about or that no one had ever asked me. I think we touched on this a little bit, that I feel I've heard either Justin Simeon or Ava DuVernay say this, or Melina Matsoukas, where sometimes you're in these interviews and no one's asking about your references or your process. Like it's so much about being in your body and working.
Yeah.
And so you had asked me questions that were sort of like fantasies of the kind of questions I wanted to be asked. But then I'm not going to say I wasn't prepared for them. I just had never been asked them. So you really had me on my toes. You know, I was really thinking about how to respond to questions that no one had ever floated by me, you know, outside of like the intimacy of my collaborators or friendship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. Well, in preparing for this, I was trying to think through what didn't I get a chance to ask last time? And also, I know for myself, I hate when people ask me the same questions that thousands of other people are asking me. So I was really trying to think through what could I ask differently this time that would not be, especially since Color of Change released that interview as a podcast. I was like, well, we can't have the same interview out in the world twice. So anyway, thank you so much. So, my understanding is you started in theater, you write, direct, and have very serious credits as a costume designer. As a director, you have, I believe, 8 short films, 2 feature films, and numerous episodes of television. And I was wondering if you imagined that you'd be this accomplished or that this was how your career would look a decade ago.
No. I think that, so a decade ago, I'm 29. Okay. I'm like, let's go back there. 29. I'd just been living in LA for about a year. No, I thought that I would be directing. I didn't know that I'd be working so much in film and or TV. I had imagined film had been, this is going to sound sort of goofy, but how I thought I would get to do theater. So I went to theater school. I really wanted to be a theater director. Most of my friends who walked out of school as directors in theater or in film were people who had money. And I say that to mean they got to like stand in that job, but not have a job. You know, they're saying like, I'm a director, but they don't do anything else. And somebody was paying their rent and they had allowances and I got out of school and I was like, I'm a waitress and a store employee. That's what I am. And I'm also a director, but that didn't even really feel like a top 3 in a way. Right. And so I really wanted to direct theater, but it's so challenging how you arrive at that. And so the option was to consider grad school. And then that's how I would get there. But like, I'd already had amassed debt from going to undergrad. So it's like, is the idea that I should be like $500,000 in debt like before I'm 30? Is that the swerve that I'm looking for here right now? And so I had thought film had felt somewhat more accessible because my friends who were directing. They were saving money and making small things, and also it felt more accessible because you left with something tangible, right? Like if you directed a play independently, all you had was the stories or the memories of that, and I guess some photos, but like that doesn't say shit. So I thought, if I could somehow traverse like the film, video, music video space, that then I would be able to somehow get back to it. So at 29, if I'd been asked like, where are you going to be in 10 years? I would assume that I would be directing theater. Whatever the off-Broadway version is in Los Angeles, I'd be directing theater here. And maybe sometimes I would get to work in film, but my thinking was that if I looked at, someone had asked me like, what do you think your whole life will look like? And I'm like, my whole life will be that I will have directed 4 or 5 films and that I would have mostly done theater. And I think I'm fully and I'm like inverted right now. So I don't know if I'll get to go back to the theater. And especially right now, whatever we're inside of, I really don't know what that looks like.
Yeah.
So no, the answer is no.
I'm curious, are you a person, because I am not, but do you have 3 or 5 year plans? Do you think in that way?
I don't. I actually feel it's a luxury to think like that. I heard this interview this weekend with Gloria Steinem, and she said it so beautifully, because I don't really think in the 3, 5, 10. I'm sort of like a what's the Saturday plan? Today's Tuesday and I'm looking at Saturday.
Same.
And she had said this thing about being able to plan or consider in that way is actually a luxury, and like implies maybe for some people like having, because you can consider in that way. And a lot of people who are poor that have less are really just thinking in the day to day. And while I am more financially comfortable in this moment than I've ever been in my whole life, I think that I am always still a little bit of a poor kid. I think I'm always going to be a little bit of a poor kid. And so, I will always have money anxiety for some reason, unless I marry a billionaire. But I'm sure I'll still be like stressed out. I'll be like, it is only $1 billion after all. But I just always have a little bit of like agita and anxiety around tomorrow. So I really am thinking more, I maybe have like a year plan.
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, right before we started this, the 3 of us were talking about being in this moment and trying to do your work and trying to plan for future work. And I find it, one of the scarier things is looking at what future work looks like. I have committed to future work, but it's so much in the ...
Right.
And I don't totally know how to make myself comfortable with like not firm plans.
Yeah. I think there are some people, I totally relate to what you're saying about, my mother would be horrified if I referred to myself as a poor kid, but I didn't feel.
No, by the way, but I'm also like, my parents aren't listening to this. Never gonna hear
Well,
this.
no, but I mean, I didn't feel solid, right? And that I relate to that. I felt like, I was very clear about what things cost. I was clear that we didn't have it. I was clear that I needed to work to have things. And so I understand that. But I also know people who have similar backgrounds. I think the planning for them is this kind of security. So I think it's a personality, it's a disposition. But I hear what Gloria is saying around the sort of freedom to do that as well. There is a kind of luxury in that. But I also think for some personality types, it's a necessity.
That totally makes it. I wonder if it's also rearing, right? Like, I don't know that I saw my parents plan like that. And if they did, they didn't invite me into it. I really felt like we were looking at the day to day. And I have only recently, like in the last year or two, become comfortable with talking about not having had. And I think some of it is obviously shame. There's tons of shame around that. But my mom would be so sad if she knew that I talked about it in that way, because I think implying that you didn't have also means that maybe you were lacking. And I certainly wasn't. And I don't know if you feel that way too. Like there was always food. I always, I got Air Jordans because I wanted Air Jordans. Like,
Right.
I wore not a Tommy Hilfiger and Guess jeans. Like we were good, but there wasn't excess, right? There wasn't like, I knew when I was asking, I felt sometimes bad about asking for things because I knew there was a counting, but yeah, so my mother would be mortified. And if she were ever, I would never like say it in a space where I'm like, maybe she would find that. If she's going to find that, you can't say that because then I'll have a lot of explaining to do. I'll be like, someone told me to say that.
I have this is sort of related. I'm curious for you. I was talking with a really good friend about their partner's child who they're, becoming very close to. And we were thinking about this child doing something that we relate to, which is world building. And so I was curious for you what kinds of toys you played with around 8 or 9, because I think that's indicative of a kind of capacity to build. And so just wondering what you were playing with.
Wow, what a great question. I was a collector of Barbies. And
oh my God, we are best friends.
So I had, at my cap, I had 110 Barbies and 2 Ken dolls. I had the one, I didn't have the really nice mansion that like opened. I didn't have that one. I had the mansion that was 3 stories and had an elevator on the side. And like a cardboard back, with like a tub, but it's like drawing. And then I had, I think, 2 or 3 skippers. And I did full scenes that would play out for days, weeks. And my parents knew that they had to leave the thing set up because we were mid scenes, I think I remember mostly like dolls having sex and not obviously understanding the what is the term, like the actual like mechanics of how like intercourse happened, because I had like before around this time probably been introduced to softcore porn, which I, by way of like watching Red Shoe Diaries late at night, like my parents had a satellite, so I had like, I don't even think Skinamax existed, but like wherever Red Shoe Diaries played.
I think it was HBO or Showtime.
So that, like, I watched that. And so I thought like sex was just like pressing. So the dolls did a lot of pressing. It's a good deal of pressing. Some people had tissue under clothes because they were pregnant. Like I got that a press led to that. And my parents just like let me do that without editing me. So I think that's my earliest memory of directing, is directing the dolls and their sagas,
Oh my gosh. I'm 100, like 1,000% relating to that. My mother didn't want me to have dolls because it was not a feminist thing to have these dolls. And someone gave her dolls to me. She gave me 50 dolls when I was 9 years old. And I lost my mind. And so I don't know that I ever had 100, but I definitely had like maybe added 10 more to that collection. And also, I didn't have a house. Says everything about my mother. I had, there was something that converted from an apartment to an office. So it was like the 9 to 5 setup.
That's genius. It was more of like a 9 to 5 story.
Totally.
Yes.
And then I would build, their apartments with shoeboxes. And so I like made little beds for them, and I used our hand cloths as like their comforters. But same thing, I had entire soap operas and also would photograph them. And I still have the photographs of like
photos?
setting up the
That's
scenes.
So great. You, regarding like the kind of story, did you do, what do you call it? Did you watch soap operas with your grandma or your mom?
Yeah, with my grandmother, not my mother.
Because I wonder if that's some of the inspiration of that kind of storytelling, because it was like ridiculous. So I feel like General Hospital and All My
Dynasty.
Children, One Life to Live. Like I think
Dallas.
that really fueled my kind of storytelling.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. Because that's what I was assuming. We were talking about, for my friend, he was talking about Legos. And I think Legos and Barbies have a very similar capacity of world building. So amazing. What was your focus of study in high school, and what made you decide to go to NYU?
So I went to a science high school. It's called Midwood, and it's next to Brooklyn College. And I really wanted to be a psychologist or psychiatrist. I had been in therapy from when I was little. Little being like 8 or 9, I had started therapy, and then by the time I was in high school, I was doing individual therapy and group therapy. And I think my parents, it's not because they're particularly open people. I think I arrived at therapy because my mom and stepfather were separating. And my mom and stepfather were separating, and my mom was getting back together with my biological father. And I think that while no one wanted to talk to me about that, they understood that something was like off its fucking rocker. So that like I should talk to someone about how I was feeling, which was like sad and confused. That my biological father, who I had not met that much in my life, suddenly was now becoming my dad. And so it was very jarring for me. So I started therapy very young, and I really liked it a lot. I really responded to it. And so I felt I would have been good at that. And it seemed like kind of a worthy. My parents, of course, wanted me to be a doctor because that felt like a real job. And I think they still are one. I think they realize the window is diminishing where that could be my next life, because I don't think they told them. They're like, what's the job you have in this moment? So I wanted to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And I also ran track and field. And so I really wanted to go to the Olympics. That was like my dream. I'd been running since I was 3 or 4. I had a coach. I had qualified for the Junior Olympics, and I was like, I'm going to do that, but that has a cap. You know, runners, you can't do that for the rest of your life unless you're going to move into being a coach. And so my feeling was I would do that, then it would, cap out at 24, 25, and then I would go to medical school and be, a doctor. When none of these happened. None of them. Not a single one. None of them happened.
Well, I think there's an interesting parallel between being a psychologist and a director, though. Because I think a really good director is basically playing that role with your actors. If you're doing the kind of acting directing that you do, right? Like if you're in the Cassavetes school of like, I'm getting in there with you, you have to be a really good listener and a therapist.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a degree. I mean, there's obviously a lot of psychology in being in this space and like being in our bodies that you have to like play. But yeah, I hadn't really ever considered that. I think you're right, actually. There's a lot of listening, and there's a lot of taking.
If you want to be evil, yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of listening and taking and finding a sort of even, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not too off. I'll tell my parents that. I'll tell them that's what I got from this. I'll tell them. It's almost the same, you guys.
I wanted to move into something that I observe in you. You may not see it, but you seemed like someone really grounded in like a sense of who you are. And I see that as a kind of freedom. And I wanted to ask you how you got to be so free.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. I really feel that too, but I feel aware of that in a way that I don't know how long it's been per se, but I am in this year, last year, I would say I really felt aware of a kind of freedom that I had not maybe had access to before. I think that it has taken so long to get here, whatever here is, but it has taken long to get to this part of the board game. And why I am where I am in this is because I have always been true to myself. It's because I've been comfortable with saying no. And when I look back, the moments that I feel bad about or sad about are moments where I didn't stand up for myself, or I felt unsafe, or I felt like I didn't have my voice. And that's not, that's like 50-50, right? I think most of the time I really stood up for myself. Most of the time I was really comfortable with who I was. And I just like, as I near 40, I think if I do get to be here for another 40 years, like this next chapter has to be more of the other thing and less of the one that didn't make me feel good. And like I said, it took so long to get here. And I feel for the first time ever, beyond the like, oh, I feel financially comfortable, I also feel a little bit, I don't want to say set, but I feel like I have never in my life been like, I think I'm going to be okay. And I really think I'm going to be okay. And I don't know why.
Sense like a security.
Yeah, I just have like a sense of security that I haven't had before. And I think that having financial security, emotional, mental, spiritual security has just allowed me to kind of be like a little bit like, fuck it. I'm a little bit like, and if you don't like it, you should go. I think the other thing is that I've done a lot of editing in my life, like editing of people. Editing of people that don't feel good, editing of voices that aren't working for me. Because this, like in our professional life, we don't get to edit as much, and we're a lot of times surrounded by like ghouls. So, so I try to like clean my ghoul closet in the personal space, and I'm very active about my cleaning. Like just today, I was like, oh yeah, I think that person has to go. I was like, so we're going to have to wrap that out. Like, I was like, yeah, that person's not feeling good. So I think they're going to have to go. And I find that it's a little bit ruthless or maybe a little bit callous sometimes, but it's what works for me. I don't need any naysayers. Like I said, like we have to be surrounded by so many ghouls so often that we do not have a choice of whether or not we want to be around them. So where I do get to choose, I just like, I'm at a capacity for like bad vibes, so it's, I don't have time for that. So you got to go.
Yeah.
So I think that that's it. I just started editing a while ago, and I realized that I am my best when I give a little less shits about how people see me. And then people also respond to me. Like people actually are like more turned on by me or more excited by me when I'm a little bit like, I don't care about that.
Yeah.
So, and I like her too. I like that version of me too.
Do you have in your life a like council of folks whom you lean upon with your work, like for critique and that you trust to tell you when shit stinks?
Yeah, I do. I hope that this is something I have a lot of anxiety around. Your question is two-pronged for me, or it's doing two lights are kind of going off. And one is, I hope that I always have that. I hope that I don't ever arrive to a place that is so comfortable in my life, like emotionally, financially, where it's like, as much as I want people to always say yes to me, there's something really good about people saying no, right? And I want to make sure that I always do have like people who can say no to me, or people who are comfortable with pushing me or just holding me accountable, right? Like, yes, I would like to just like walk into every room just gliding, but I recognize that like, that's not actually that useful to me. That kind of ease isn't 100% useful. So I do hope to always have a jury of people who do hold me accountable. And I do have that. I'd like to have a few more people in that realm, because I think some of my people are just people who've been in my life for a very long time, like my best friend of 20 plus years. And the reason I'd like to have more people is that it's mostly men, and it's people that I've known just for so much of my life. And I don't have I don't have a woman in that group, actually. It's all men. And I think that there would be value in having a lady in that space, a lady or two in that space, because it's like a small group of men. And it's great. They're great. Love them. They're strong. They're awesome. But I can also see how some people you grow out of. And I don't mean grow out of the friendship. I mean, you grow out of like, this is where I am moving, and you're not necessarily, like, for instance, my last movie, the protagonist is a Black woman. And of those 4 or 5 people, 2 of them are white guys. And one is my ex-husband, and the other is my oldest friend. And with my oldest friend, sometimes when he noted, I was like, oh, you actually just don't understand this psychology of this person. And it's not because he understands my psychology, but I'm like, you don't understand the 19, 20-year-old girl from Detroit. You just don't get her.
Right.
And so many of your notes are totally valid, but like some of the things you're bumping up against are just like who this person is at their core. So when I was working on that movie, I really felt like, oh, I needed to bring a couple more people in. But you know this, it's hard. That's hard.
Yeah.
It's very vulnerable. And it's just tough to bring someone into like the vulnerable stage of your work. Like if I can draft one, that's the embarrassing part. It's embarrassing. So it's got to be someone also who's like, I know and believe that it's going to be good on the other side of it. Yeah. And so it's a little scary to bring people in because not everyone's there for the right reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it gets harder. What I'm noticing with other friends who are in a sense similar to yours, that they're holding on to those of us they've known for 10 and 20 years because you don't know why new people are around. So it's just
that's what I mean. Exactly. Yeah. It's like my best friend since I was 19. I'm like, well, you knew me when my shit stank. like my farts are bad. I have weird gut stuff. So like, when you note me, I know that there is no other motive. Like it's not, you're never like trying to unconsciously make me feel bad about myself, where like that new person who, I like and they like me, I just don't know yet.
Yeah.
I don't really have a lot of friends who do the same thing. I have friends who are writers. I have friends who work in production. I have friends who are producers. I have friends who do a lot of other things, but I don't have a friend who is a close friend who is also a director. I don't have that. And I think that some of that is competitiveness. And I would like to. There are directors who I really like and who I'm friendly with, but we're not close. And it's sort of like when actors are friends, right? I don't know how you get past the thing where someone's like, oh, I'm doing this now. And even if you don't want it, where your brain's just like, well, I'm not doing that. Is it because I'm a loser? You know what I mean? Like, even if you don't want it, like a friend's like, I'm doing this thing for Netflix. And then I like felt all weird about it. Not about them, but about myself, where I was like, well, why am I not doing that for Netflix? And I was like, because you don't want it. Like, I literally had to be like, hey, you don't want this. And I was struggling with, I was having two feelings. I was having these feelings in parallel where I was really happy for them that they were moving forward. But then I started to ask myself, like, well, where am I and what's going on with me? And I think the problem is that I think this is about actually like being a woman and being a person of color, where I feel I was raised in the era of there's only room for one. And I am working against, I intellectually know and believe that is not true, but like my first layer of skin is still in that game. So I'm like, I start to just have anxiety that the pods are all running out, or there's not, there aren't enough kitchens or stoves. I don't know what the fucking metaphor is, but like whatever it is it feels like the door is closing, and I start to have like panic around that. And I think that my contemporaries are around the same age. We're doing the same thing. And I think we were all kind of reared that way. And so I feel like even if like it's unconscious, but I think you have this weird, you have competitiveness with people where you're like, I'm being left behind. I don't want to be left behind. You know, I want houses too.
Yeah. Well, I'm having an extra thing because I wanted to be a director, and then I got pulled into other paths because just like not having enough confidence, people telling me I sucked, you know, all of those things. And I look at younger
those people. They're great. Those people, they're great.
I'm so thankful for them. But looking at this younger generation, like, and I hate to be like, oh, I'm so old, but looking at like the pure millennials who are 28, 29, and the opportunities afforded to them after their first film, who are Black and who are women, I'm just like, I'm so happy for them, but I'm also like,
oh, but of course. I made a first movie a few years ago that people were like, ew, please go away. And I just think if it happened now, how would that be different? You know, I think I was like right at the end of like the no thank you phase.
Yeah.
That next year people were like, okay, we're ready for Black girls. They need to be making movies. And I was like, but I was here like, oh, no one wanted that. But we talked a little bit about this before. I am really so grateful for how hard that was, because I learned a lot. It really taught me a lot about not only my own sense of self and expectation, but I just learned shit. I learned how to produce because that was so hard. I really learned how to like get my own shit done and how to also be okay with things not being well received, which is like a really harsh lesson. But it has prepared me for like, you know, what lies ahead in a lot of ways. But yeah, it's hard to not be jealous when it seems like some people's roads are paved where ours were just gravel. But there's also like a tenacity too, right? That those kids have. Like some of I have a handful of friends who are in their 20s and they just seem like really like tenacious and
clear. And
just like their sense of self, where I'm just like, oh my God, if I even had a fraction of that. I mean, at like 25, 26, if you told me I was stupid, I was like, you're right.
Exactly.
I should go to sleep. Like, I was like, I am a dumb. And like, I think of just like some of those people that I dated at that age and how much they like just really screwed me over, but I screwed myself over because I let them in and I believed them.
Right.
And then I spent so much not constructive time trying to build myself up.
Yeah. Because
I let these fucking turds eat away at me. And like, some of my younger friends seem to just like, not have that, or if they do have people like that, they just know immediately like, oh, they gotta go.
Yeah.
And I'm like, gosh, it took me so long to get there.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, I guess that's what happens when you inherit something that's so deeply rotted. There's almost like no room, right? You don't have room to not have self-confidence when there's a clock in Times Square that's like the earth is over in 105 days. I mean, you don't have time. Like if you are 25 and that clock goes up, you're like, well, we gotta wrap shit up. We gotta close some deals. We gotta buy some stuff. Like, cause I have to be like financially comfortable enough so that when the world is on fucking fire, I can move to the top of the mountain because not everyone's gonna be able to get there, you know? Yeah. So I guess that's what you get.
Yeah. You're listening to Mini Lumens, brought to you by Black Star.
Hi, my name is Janicza Bravo, and this is Many Lumens.
I want to pivot a little bit. Do you have any advice if you were giving to an emerging director who was about to embark upon their first feature? Like, what advice would you give them?
I think that there's probably two things. One, I wish that you can't have all the fights. You can't have all the fights. And I believe that you can have 3 fights in the process of a film.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a fight in the pre-production stage, you can have a fight in production, and you can have a fight at post-production. So I believe there are 3 fights you get to have. As my mother would call them, nigger fits. That's what my mom would say. She would either call them nigger fits, or she could say you can get niggerish. That obviously these are words only allowed to some of us in this world here. But so I really believe you're allowed 3 fights, and all that is to say is I really think if you kind of ingest that, it allows you to let more things like kind of roll off your back, because there is something to fight for almost every day, but you can't. You just like mentally and emotionally you can't. And I think it's long haul, long road. And so I would say that's kind of like number one advice, is that you can't fight all the fights. And then I would say the second thing is, about trying to find your people, the people you want to building, in theater, it's sort of like the troupe, right? Like, who's your theater troupe? Mm-hmm. And that it's okay to walk away from, I think I like started thinking like I needed to like show up with all my people. I needed to have my DP. I needed to have my editor, my composer. I need to have all those people. And I put a lot of pressure on myself to like have a team. And so that when I didn't have one of those people, I felt a little bit like I felt a little, I don't know, discombobulated or something. And so I think it's okay if like you amass those people slowly, or if you find those people, but it is so important to build your team. I mean, I was thinking about this actually around the conversation of like trying to make crews more diversified, and not the in front of the camera. I think the in front of the camera conversation has been in the zeitgeist enough, and I think that there could be more aggressive change, but I do think that like in front of the camera that is happening. Mm-hmm. And so, but I still feel like we're a little delayed in the behind the camera space. And I was thinking about like when you look at this sort of old guard of filmmakers, right? Like someone like a Ron Howard or Steven Spielberg, or even the Coen brothers, like people who have their teams, like they have their teams, and how hard it is to amass your people so that when you're on day one, you're 50 pages into the conversation. You're not day one is not page one, Right. And how that is such a gift. And so I think about like, well, how do you talk about like parity behind the camera when those people have their teams, mm-hmm. Like they know they've got their like long running VFX guy, they've got their long running costume designer. And it's really hard to change those people because you've like figured out how your whole comes together.
Yeah. Which means it starts even earlier, right? Because those teams get assembled when people are in graduate school or undergrad or working as PAs, or you know what I mean? And so we're not talking about the entry is not there.
Absolutely. Which is why for so long I felt really bad that I hadn't gone to film school, because I really felt like I had missed out on those early relationships, Mm-hmm. The country club, it's the country club of it mm-hmm. all, right? Like I met Dan, who knows Chad, and who's friends with Joan. Like I just like didn't have those people. So I was like, I don't, my kid doesn't play tennis with his kid. Like I just didn't have that. So I was like, how am I going to do this? But yeah, I think thinking about like building your team, and it's also like, when you do think of the movie, the movie is a very long road. So it's also like, am I going to want to talk to this person for the next 3 years? Like whenever I audition anybody for a role, I don't mean acting. I mean like the like crew people or the post people. It's like, I have to talk to you for how long? Mm-hmm. Because I barely want to talk to you through this 45-minute conversation. So like, yeah, we're not going to be able to do years, because it's years, maybe in the like streaming space where they're greenlighting like smaller movies, maybe those movies happen really fast because the scripts already exist and they're just as a director for hire, and maybe those do happen in like a year calendar because there's so much infrastructure. But at least for me and with original work, I don't think everything is minimum 2 years, minimum.
Yeah.
So you're looking at 2, 3, 4, 5 years of making stuff. So you really got to want to talk to those people.
I want to say that I love your television choices.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm so curious, you know, one, you get some of the best episodes of some of my favorite shows. So we talked about Juneteenth from Atlanta. You have the Houston episode of Mrs. America.
Oh, you watched?
Oh, yeah. I love Forever. I love Divorce. I'm so curious how you evaluate what you're going to take on.
I say no a lot. And I'm sure the people who represent me, who collect a percentage of that, are not always happy about that because I do say no a lot. And I really, if I don't care, I think so much about like, I may have already said this about the job that's going to get you the house, or the job that's going to get your parents the house, or the job that's going to get you, like the houses job. And I wonder, like, when am I going to get a houses job? Because like really the way I'm working, it's like apartments. But I don't know. I don't know that maybe I'm not ready for a houses job. I think that it took so long to get here, and I really cherish the time that I get to spend doing this. And I mentally and emotionally, if I don't care, I have found for myself, I did one job as it'll get me this. Like I was like, I need to do this job because then it's going to do this for me. I've done 2 jobs like this, one in the commercial space and then one in the TV space. Mm-hmm. And they were really hard. It was really hard. It was just really hard to go every day. Yeah. And it wasn't even like that long, but it was just really hard because I found I had one foot out the door the whole time, emotionally. Yeah. And I barely, like, people would be talking to me and I would be fading. And I was like, Jay.
I was going to ask you, does your body shut down? Because my body shuts down when I'm not supposed to do it. I'm so sleepy. I'm so, Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't there. I was literally like, is there candy? I mean, I was like so gone, and I was like, this is dark. And it was so dark because I could like see, I was in my body and I could see myself fading. And I was like, sis, we got to get it together because they're watching and you're fading. So it's very hard for me to be present if I don't want it. So that's like that's sort of the main, I guess, step one in being a little bit picky. I've also just been really, I have been fortunate. I would say I have been fortunate in the TV space that most of the time when someone is asking me to direct, I'm being sent usually like the island episode. And I say the island episode, that's always like, this is the episode that leaves the show. This is the episode that's no longer like in Divorce. It was like, we're not in New York anymore.
Right.
Or in Atlanta, it's like, we're leaving the show a little bit. And in Mrs. America, we're leaving the show a little bit. And Dear White People, it was also like, we're leaving the campus. And I was like, I always seem to be leaving. It's always like, this is going away from the thing that we've built. And I think that it happened in Forever too. It's like, now we've left the first 2 episodes and I'm like, oh, okay. I really think I haven't done an episode of TV where someone's staying. It's always like, we gotta go. We gotta go where we are, from where we are.
I was going to liken it to, there's something particularly in Mrs. America where these otherwise minor characters for this one episode get this moment of interiority, which is also something that I see as a through line in your other work. You can see the characters like Nia Long and Lemon, or the house staff and Woman in Deep, like these people who we shouldn't be paying attention to, you make sure that we do. And I feel like these episodes are also these like either the minor characters getting the moment or the conventional leads on an unconventional trip, they're going away. And so I thought in this particular episode, it's like so poetic that the character's name is Alice. And I was like, in some sense, it's like a wonderland. And so wondering if that vibes for you at all, And I was like, really, I even wrote to myself, this is not a question. It was just sort of wanting to, sort of bring that up because I feel like that's what, there's definitely an absurdity in your aesthetic. And so feeling like you get the absurd episode.
Absolutely. I mean, I think
even in Atlanta, which is already absurd.
Totally. I think one of the hardest things about television directing, I would say, perhaps before the last few years, and I think it's still true because I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a ton of prestige in the TV space, and I think a lot of the prestige in the TV space does welcome attitude. And when I say attitude, I mean like a director with opinions, right? Or like they kind of like want POV and they want you to come in and like shake it up. That said, TV directing, even in the prestige space, I think there is an umbrella. You enter and there's an ecosystem. There's an established ecosystem and you have to find your footing in what those rules are. And I've been fortunate that generally when I'm invited, it's like, we do have an ecosystem, but in this episode, we wanted this to happen, or we wanted. So I'm usually invited in by people who already have a sense of, they have some sense of my own vocabulary. And so when I'm being invited in, it's because there is a little bit, there's room for things to go a little off the chain. And yeah, I don't think only really a couple of times have I been sent something that's like season 4. And it's like episode 5, but usually I also oftentimes am doing like the second to last episode or the 3rd episode. And I say those to mean it's like, those first 2 episodes establish a world, so then something happens in a 3, or I'm doing the second to last because they're like leaving before they go back to their end, It seems to be the space that I've inhabited, and I'm so grateful for it. I mean, I really feel I've been able, short films, the short films I made before I made my features allowed me to like do this film school for myself. And TV directing has allowed me to sharpen those tools that I taught myself. And also because when I've made my own work, my work has been so small that, being on a TV show and someone's like, you want a drone for that? And I'm like, a drone? Or they're like, oh, we got a crane for 3 days. And I'm like, crane? And I don't even need it, but I'm like, we're going to use a crane. We're going to use a crane because I want to know how to fucking use a crane. Or I want to know like, how many people does it take to do that? How does that work? Okay, great. That's a lot. Never doing that. That's unless you have the money. I'm like, it's a lot of time on the fucking crane, unless you have the infrastructure for it. Or like, my last feature, we only could use a Steadicam for 2 days, and you're on a TV show where they're like, there's always a Steadicam there. And you're like, you could do the whole episode on a Steadicam the whole time? You just have a person who can do that? What? So it's just allowed me to flex my own muscles. And because my shorts gave me room to fail, without people really watching. And now, obviously, in the TV space, like more people are watching, but I have used it as an opportunity also to be okay with failing because it's not mine. But really, it's more, I would say maybe failing is a negative, and an opportunity to experiment and an opportunity to play with tools that I don't have that I haven't had access to. So that, I feel I get better with every episode. And then I can take my skills to my own work or to other TV directing.
Yeah. I want to move forward to talk about your most recent film, Zola, a little bit. And back in August, A24 released a trailer for Zola. And People magazine ran a headline with the supporting actress Riley Keough's name instead of the lead, Taylor Page. And it was such a terrible moment, but also incredible, because it illuminated, I think, what so many of us have been saying for so long about the erasure of people of color, and particularly for Black women, getting pushed all the way to the sideline, even in their own stories. And I don't have a question about it, but I just was curious. I loved A24's clapback that they
It's
were
great.
there right away. It was so perfect. But just wondering if you had any reflections on that moment, and you don't have to, but also I wanted to go into what attracted you to Zola.
I think A24 did a great job. They were very proud of themselves too. I had someone be like, I didn't even know it had happened. I'm not on Twitter, which is wonderful for me. But I am on Instagram. So it's like, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook, but I'm on Instagram. So I'm like, I'm hanging out in some cesspool, but I would say I think those two are probably like the dumpiest. So I missed it. And how I found out about it was someone from A24 was like, we dealt with it. And I was like, dealt with what? And they're like, we dealt with it. Don't worry about it. The people stuff is handled. And I had no idea what they were talking about. And then within minutes of that, I was like, great, glad you dealt with it. No clue what it. And rather than asking, because I was having that thing where I was like, obviously I'm supposed to know what they're talking about, so just move past it. Someone else then sent it to me and they were like, that is so fucked up. And then I like totally caught up and I thought they dealt with it really beautifully. It's almost like we couldn't have paid for better press, right?
Mhm.
Like they were sort of like, so that we released a teaser for our trailer and they were almost like, uh, I don't know, it felt like a really great sort of like add on to the thing. That's what the movie is about that. And then they did the thing that the movie is about. I mean, at the beginning of the year, I think it's Variety. Is it? Yeah, it was Variety had printed this picture of me, but it was a different Black woman. Being like, we're so excited about Zola or something, but it wasn't even me. It was somebody else. And they
Oh
had
my
like
gosh.
tweeted it and put it on their Instagram. And I was just like, I mean, and it is not exactly the same. It's not like they put a picture of a white woman and said it was me, but it's under a similar umbrella of just like not all the way considered and not all the way like it just shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have happened in this year.
Yeah.
I kind of love that they did it because it means that the thing we're talking about in the movie is evergreen,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
this question of whether or not I actually was asking this too recently, and I don't know if you're wondering, like I was watching Lovecraft Country, and I worked on this TV show that maybe it'll come out this year, maybe it'll come out next year. That is an Amazon show that takes place in the 50s between it takes place between the South and California, and some of the thematics are the same. And I was like talking to a friend, and we were just like, the conversation started because I'd watched Lovecraft and I was talking about the comparisons to the show that I had just worked on. And then I was on their Instagram and somebody was like, I'm tired of race. I don't want to see race anymore. And so the conversation my friend and I were having, who's white, was like, are we entering race capacity? Are we about to arrive at like our peak of like too much of this conversation? And I don't know. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. And what I mean is obviously there's a lot more room to make more work. Clearly there's like plenty that's not about it. But somehow people start to get tired when it's like too much about women, or they start to get tired when it's like too much about Black people. And so I just wondered if we had entered that. And what that said to me was, no, there's still room.
Right.
And whoever decides, and obviously it's not about whether I think there's room, it's more like who decides it and who's greenlighting it, right? Who's actually like, you and I can say we want to make whatever the fuck we want to make. Somebody else has to pay for it. So it's like, are people actually funding those stories? And I think that what people did in 2020, literally in the moment that we were in,
of an uprising. I mean, it was like
they're literally in the middle of
tone deaf.
fucking like protesting. We're in the middle of being like, this woman was shot in her home, and people were like, yeah, but there's a white lady in the Black movie. And you're like, huh? Yeah. Great.
At Sundance, we talked a little bit about the Zola story being at the intersection of David Lynch and Cardi B. And, you know, I think that for me feels like it's the dark absurdist humor of Lynch, which you're into. And then I think it also brings up this sort of hood feminism, to quote Mickey Kendall, or kind of lower frequency politics, to quote Paul Gilroy, that Cardi so fiercely embodies. And particularly at this moment, I'm thinking about her interactions with Candace Owens. But what were your references for the film? And yeah, if you want to share those.
Yeah, for sure. Most of my references tend to be photographic and more than movies. And I think that I try to veer away from leaning really hard into movies because I'm a very good copier. Like I unconsciously will copy a lot.
Understood. I do that with accents.
Oh yeah. I just like, if I love something, it will embed itself. And not that I'm like, this is my idea, not that, but it will just embed itself and then I'll kind of repeat it. So I try to stay away from watching movies, or what I watched was like so insane, right? Where it was like, well, we're not making Showgirls, but we should watch Showgirls. So it was mostly there were a handful of photos that we kind of stayed in. I really, really liked. There are these two moments where we kind of try to replicate some of what Deanna Lawson does in her work. And I responded so much to her portraiture because it felt like it's sort of like John Singer Sargent's portraits, but like updated through Black gaze in Black environment. It's also so much about whether or not it's Black. I don't know if she's not photographed Black people, but it's also like in praise of like where people are at. And what I mean is like,
yeah,
I had seen photos of a couple in a kitchen that looks like the kitchen that my parents had. And I had never considered that I'd never thought that was worth photographing. I'd never thought it was worth cementing that, because I'd been embarrassed about the toaster oven or embarrassed about the kind of fridge. And that like, she basically like imbued the energy of like John Singer Sargent's work into a tier that had not really ever been documented except for tragic purposes, except for this is how the other half lives. And so I liked the energy of that kind of care. And so she was a really big inspiration for me. And there's another photographer who I had met who's Argentinian, who goes by the name Suffer Rosa, like suffer as in we are suffering, and Rosa, Rosa, who's Argentinian, who does a lot of spaces that are empty spaces throughout Argentina. Lots of night work. His work is just so beautiful. And so I really my cinematographer and I had kind of like hung out in most of their work. And there were a few others, but those were kind of like our tent poles of what we had most admired. And then cinematically, I asked the question of a few people where I was like, there are two questions. I was like, name a movie that has a Black woman and a white woman as friends. Almost everybody said Clueless. Almost everyone. I was like, one of those. But then there's also like other kinds of versions of that where like there's like a slave and not a slave, but I mean like where they're actually like meeting each other. And so Clueless came up a lot. And then the other was like, can you name a movie with a Black female protagonist who is empowered? And Pam Grier, a lot of people center around like movies starring Pam Grier in this period. And so, I looked at Coffee, Jackie Brown, as kind of the two we had narrowed in on. And then I really liked Killing of a Chinese Bookie because that had like really great lighting and strip clubs. And of course we looked at Showgirls just because like that movie is so out of that. How does that happen? How did they make that movie? Have you seen that movie? Every time I watch it, I'm like, how?
I haven't watched it in forever. So I saw it when it came out, but I don't remember it.
There are so many scenes in it that you're like, what's the set vibe? Like, what's happening? How are we talking about this? It's so crazy. But I love it because I think he's crazy. Mm-hmm. He's just like, he feels like an insane person. I mean, it just is like all of the ideas, right? Like if you look at, what's the space one with Arnold Schwarzenegger where the woman has 3 breasts? Total Recall. So it's like a Total Recall, Starship Troopers, like he just it's like acid, right? It's like acid meets director makes movies. And I just think it's such a like celebration of like just really radical shit.
I was watching a clip from the Criterion Collection that they've done of your films, and you discuss not going to film school and openly admitting on set and in, production when you don't know something, which I think is really, really important. But I think in our sort of patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist world, we're supposed to have mastery, which is something that I really despise, right? Like even the language that we use about mentorship and, all these things, it does not acknowledge that different people have knowledge that they can share. And it also leaves us without room for play and discovery. And so it's something that I have been exploring as a manager, right, of employing people and making sure that I say I don't know or I apologize when I've made a mistake, trying to break down some of that. And I know there's two filmmakers in particular, Terrence Nance and Jen and Kiru. We've talked about trying to decolonize, to use a sort of loaded word, but film sets, right? Because they're sort of loaded in this colonial moment and it is all about domination and war, right? Like every word we use, the language, the setup, there are in fact vets who run sets, And so everything about it is so rooted in that kind of hyper masculinity.
Militaristic, right? Like it feels kind of like fascistic almost. I like that you use the word colonialism because I remember in my first few sets, I didn't know that I could pick people. I mean, this is so good. I didn't go to film school, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I should have at least considered that or asked somebody. So I thought that the crew was so much about, like, my producers were really putting the crew together.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd had opinions and I had met people, but sometimes people didn't work, or I only knew 1 or 2 people who could do a job. And if they weren't available, then I was meeting the people my producers had set me up with. And I think it was on my 4th or 5th short. Actually, it was Woman in Deep. I looked around, and besides the Black actors who were in it, who were basically they were playing invisible people.
Right.
So besides the invisible people, there was me, and I was like, oh my God, I'm on a plantation. I'm on a plantation and I'm running it. What happened? Because everybody was white. Everyone was white. And I was the only, because it was at the very beginning of the day. So that cast isn't even there. So it was like, we were loading in. Someone had asked me about where I was setting up craft services. Cause that's like another fun thing that happens when I'm directing is that people are always like, where are you putting the chairs? I'm sitting in one. But anyways, so it was super early. Someone had just asked me where I was setting up coffee. And then as I was like being annoyed at that person and then looking around, I realized everybody was white except for me. And I thought, oh my God, it's a plantation and I am the master. And when that happened, I was like, oh, it can't be like this. And I don't know if I'm allowed to hire people, but I have to hire people who also look like me because I feel crazy right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally interrupted your question, but you were asking about not knowing, right? And being comfortable.
Well, I wanted to ask you just about, I think you're sort of getting to it, but what are the ways in which you're subverting tradition, right? And how do you think we can do that moving forward?
It's in the TV space, it's really tricky. And I try, but I feel that I haven't really worked on something yet where this hasn't happened. And it's always my relationship with actors is always pretty solid. It's mostly like the crew, as a lot of the people in most of the television shows I've worked in are like older crews. And I find that there's always a reset for me. And by that, I mean that even if I've had a strong day, when I come back the next day, it's as if yesterday didn't happen and I have to start all over again. And that's really painful. And if I ever get to be in charge of a show or a set like that, I hope to somehow undo that dynamic. But I do think it has to do with hiring practices. I feel like a lot of that is like government, it's a trickle down, right? Like who's actually at the top of those ecosystems, as I'm sure and maybe it's less about who's at the top, because I think that those human beings are really working at having a sense of control. And so when you're working with an AD or a line producer, I think those people feel powerless in a lot of other places in their life. And so when given this job, it is a place for them to like really engage their sense of self and control. And so I think when someone like me shows up, they are really drawn to like being able to control me, and we tend to not work well together because I'm like, who are you? Anyways, so I think in the TV space that's harder, and in my own work, it's about who I invite in. You know, my crew. The biggest accomplishment for me about Zola, whether or not the movie does well or is liked when it exists in the world, is that every department head was a person of color or a woman. And we did that. Like, you know, I fucking did that. It mattered to me. It really mattered to me. I actually set out just to make sure that it was mixed, and then it just ended up being that way. And I didn't notice it until my production designer, like halfway through prep, we left a production meeting and she's like, did you know that everyone's a woman or a person of color? And I stepped back and I was like, oh, yeah. In the end, I just hired who I wanted to work with and who I wanted to talk to. And yes, I had met different, you know, I met men for parts where I hired women. I had met white people for parts where I hired Black people. And I just kind of like, I assembled the people that I wanted to spend that time with. And it all ended up being that way, which, you know, while working in Florida presented its own challenges of bringing like, you know, having, you know, a Middle Eastern AD with like a mostly camera crew of like white old guys under a female DP. It was like, you know, it had its own darkness, of course. But I think that's how it happens. And by inviting, you know, by getting to invite the people in, I was able to run the world the way that I wanted. But look, it also had its challenges. It wasn't a fucking breeze all the time. And I think that for me, I am still in this body. I sound the way that I do. I look the way that I do. And even with some of the people that I invite in, I have to prove myself to them, you know?
Yeah.
I was like looking back on some of my relationship with my DP on this actually, and some of the moments where I haven't really voiced this out loud, but like some of those moments where she would be condescending towards me, and it was but I believe it was unconscious. And I think it's just, well, you didn't go to film school and you don't know what this equipment is called, you know, because I'm talking about things in a sort of esoteric way. I'm talking more like feeling and color, and that how she was reared in the environment where she went into film school, being a woman, it's like, you have to know what the things are called to be good at the job. And here I was coming in going like, I'm good at the job and I don't know what the things are called. And you know what? I have no fucking interest in knowing what they're called. Like, I was like, I don't want to know what that's called. You know what it's called. You bring it to the set. I'll tell you what I want to happen with it. And that's kind of like my attitude around working. And I think people are like very challenged by that. Like, I don't need to know what the things are called to be able to do it, because I am like working through pictures based on how I feel. It's all feeling for me. It's feeling to feeling. We're telling a story through feeling, because in the world of theater directing, it's not about the equipment. It's the actors. The actors are literally all you have. You have actors on a stage and they have to tell your story. And to me, when I arrived at film, I was like, it's the same. It's the actors on a stage. And you invite the really good set designer, the really good costume designer, the great lighting guy, and they're going to build the world around you. You're all going to build it together. But my job is to make sure that the actors are doing it, because that's who we're walking. When you walk out of the movie, that's the first thing. And if it's not the first thing, something's wrong. Yeah. Right? Like if you're like, that was beautiful, then it's like fucked. You know, it's just like shit. That's really like the kiss of death. You're like, well, that was beautiful. And you're like, uh-oh. Well, I really like the score. Uh-oh. Those can be on the list, but you don't want that to be the first, you know? again, I answered your question in 88 minutes. So I hope that was good.
No, that was amazing. I will wrap now, but I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I
Time.
really, really appreciate it. Like I said, my talk with you at the beginning of the year really stayed with me, and it has come up for me a few times over the last 185 years that we've been in quarantine. But I really, really thought about it because you asked this question, and I think I wonder if I'll ever have the answer to it. I feel like this is something I'll have an answer to in like 20 or 30 years. And it was, the question was about who the audience is that you are making for.
Who do you make work for?
Who do you make work for? And I have loosely thought about this question, and I didn't love my answer that I gave you then, and I've really like just thought about it regarding all of my projects, like who is it for? So I really like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Many Lumens. Visit us at manylumens.com to subscribe. And follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Many Lumens. Many Lumens is brought to you by Blackstar. This episode was produced by Patrice Worthy and Farah Rahaman, edited by David Adams, and engineered by Mike Mihalik and Dylan Garvin. Our music supervisor is Rashid Zakat. Our theme song was composed by Vijay Mohan and remixed by David DJ Little Dave Adams. Sending you light, and see you next time.